Welcome to the BBC's Global News Podcast on YouTube. Hello, I'm Oliver Conway. And today we're looking at the US-Israeli war with Iran and what it means for the oil price and the wider global economy. We're joined by the BBC's business editor, Simon Jack. And Simon, the war has been going on for more than a week. Why did we see prices shoot up at the weekend? And how serious is this moment?
Well, it came in sort of two phases, really. There's the bit leading up to the outbreak of hostilities when we saw the price of oil and gas begin to edge up since the beginning of the year because people thought something like this might happen. We then saw last week when gas prices shot up very, very sharply. Oil prices went up, but not by as much. And then this week, we've seen oil prices playing catch up. Now, the reason for that is that in the first instance, Qatar is the biggest producer of liquid natural gas in the world, certainly in the Gulf, and produces 20% of the world's supply. And what's interesting is that liquid natural gas has become the kind of balancing, the bit of the energy you get at the end to make up your stocks, and so has been very, very volatile. So we saw a sharp rise in gas prices. On oil, the supply is much more diversified around the world, and so not so much of it goes through the Strait of Hormuz, that bit between Oman and Iran, where there's a bottleneck there. So you can get oil from different places. But this week, what we've seen is as the conflict has spread, and we've now seen Iran, for example, targeting the energy infrastructure of neighbouring Gulf states. And that is quite on purpose. They see that the best way to exert leverage and pain on the rest of the world, particularly the US and others, is by knocking out some of that energy infrastructure. So you've seen attacks on oil refineries in Saudi, etc. And so the rest, I think, in a way, the kind of complacency that it's all going to be fine, it's going to be over in, within a few weeks. As the conflict has spread, as those variables get harder to control, people are now baking in their minds a longer conflict, and that's seen oil prices up. Well, at one point today, they hit $120 a barrel from just 100. So it was up some sort of 20%. It has since come down to $103 a barrel at the time we're recording right now. Part of that is due to the fact that the International Energy Agency has announced it's going to have a meeting with G7, the big economies of the world, to release what they call the Strategic Oil Reserve. This is oil set aside by companies and countries for moments exactly like this.
Yeah, we'll see if that has an impact.
I think it already has, actually. It's come down from 120 to 103. Now, in a way, it doesn't mean that you just pull some massive lever and all this oil goes whooshing out. There's no big vat of oil which has got break glass in emergency. What it is that countries around the world require their producers to keep a little bit in the terminals and refineries and whatever for moments like this, 90-day supply, generally speaking. And what that does is rather than, release lots more oil into the world, it gives a sentiment boost that the big economies are looking at it, governments are in the room, they understand the concerns, and they're trying to address it in a concerted way. So in a way, it's a sentiment booster, and it seems to some extent to have worked today.
Okay, a slight improvement.
Yeah.
But a few days ago, you mentioned Qatar. The Qatari energy minister said oil could reach $150 a barrel and, quote, bring down the economies of the world. Could it really get that bad?
It can certainly play an enormous threat. Oil, obviously, is incredibly pervasive. The cost of oil gets into just about everything. Obvious things like petrol. It also, and gas controls the price of heating and also electricity. So you obviously have a cost of living massive squeeze. You also get to a point, and I remember the last time it was around the $150 a barrel moment was just before the financial crisis back in 2007, 2008, when it hit $147 a barrel. Not inflation adjusted for anyone who's going to pick me up on that, so it was probably cheaper. But at some point, what you do is you hit a level of what they call demand destruction. So things start getting so expensive that rather than carry on doing them at a more expensive rate, you stop doing them at all because it becomes uneconomic. And so that means that economic activity that would have happened does not happen because the price of energy is so prohibitive. That demand destruction phase does begin to kick in, people think, at around $120 to about $150 a barrel. And so at that point, you do start to see economies begin to potentially slide into recession. Because inflation is a double whammy. It does two things at the same time, both of which are poisonous to economies. it puts up the cost of doing business and borrowing money to do business at the same time as it's taking money out of the pockets of the customers that you're trying to sell your stuff to. So that's why inflation can be an economy killer. And oil, with its pervasive nature, is definitely a very virulent way of getting that into the bloodstream of the world economy. So at $150 a barrel, you do start to think about economies sliding into recession, yes.
And are we already seeing damage to the global economy? Where are we seeing it? Is it in the markets? Is it in people's pockets?
Seeing it in the markets in the first instance, it's seen stock markets fall very sharply. And the rule of thumb is the more you're reliant on imported energy, the more your stock market falls. There's been a reason why, if you wake up each morning, as I do, and look at the markets, there's a reason why, for example, Korea has been one of the first to actually sort of have a circuit breaker because it's fallen so quickly they'll suspend trading. And that's because Korea is massively dependent on oil imports. But so is China. And I think there's a very interesting, perhaps underreported element to this entire drama, these hostilities, which is that China gets about 3% of its oil from Venezuela. That now is effectively controlled by the US. It gets about 16% of its oil from Iran. Well, that is effectively shut off at the moment. And something like 50% of its imports come from somewhere in the Gulf. So you can see that a lot of people are saying that, quite apart from the advertised reasons for this, which have been a little unclear depending on who you're talking to at any given point, of the nuclear disarmament or the degrading of the nuclear program. A lot of people are seeing this as a power play. The US is pretty much self-sufficient in energy. China is not. So don't forget about the US versus China dimension to what's going on here.
Yeah, and while we're talking about big powers, what does all this mean for Russia?
Well, China's dependence on oil imports could force it closer into the arms of Russia. The other thing for Russia is this is a bit of a bonus for them because obviously they are huge oil and gas producers. The price of that is going up. They've managed to find a way to sell it to people which is not the EU, for example, who've basically put a moratorium on Russian gas and oil purchases. But there's no doubt that rising energy prices are good for the Russian war machine, and that will not be lost, of course, on Ukraine, and just goes to show how the many tentacles there are of this and how energy policy, energy conflicts find their way into every walk of life. For example, I was trying to explain to a friend of mine the other day, how their chance of getting a cheaper mortgage next week has just gone down because with inflationary pressures, central banks around the world, which were beginning to see inflation fall so they could lower interest rates, those bets are off now. And actually, a lot of the betting is the next move in interest rates may well be up. So you can just see if you join the dots between these things, what's going on in the Gulf can start to affect the price of your next mortgage. And
can anything be done other than stopping the war to reverse all this?
Well, we've seen, as I mentioned earlier, the release of the potential release of the strategic oil reserve to try and calm things just a little bit. But I think most analysts will tell you that the long-term effect of what is going on the global economy depend almost entirely on how long this particular phase of the war lasts. What is interesting, there are some key Iranian facilities which have not been targeted because what the US does not want, and that where the US and Israel have fallen out slightly, is that Israel has been targeting lots of the energy infrastructure to a degree that the US doesn't really want. The US does not want to see the energy infrastructure of the Gulf, destroyed. It would like for a lot of it still to be in place and functional afterwards. What you're seeing is basically all the onshore and boat and floating oil storage vessels in the Gulf, that side of Hormuz, the top end of the Gulf, are already full. So at some point, you're going to have to stop producing because there's nowhere to put the oil you're producing. If you stop producing the oil, it can take weeks to actually get it going again. So that is bothering people because, as I say, the duration of this is one of the most important things. And if you have to start shutting down production, which takes weeks to put on, you are lengthening in a damaging way, the duration of these interruptions.
And what about Donald Trump's high-profile suggestion that they send warships to escort tankers through the Strait of Hormuz? Could that work?
Well, I've spoken to two people about that proposal. The first one was from a military dimension, which is that Iran kind of looks down on the Strait of Hormuz. So if you had a little corridor either side of US warships, unless you're going to do a ground invasion, you could take pot shots at those warships all day long from up on the hill. The other people I've spoken to are insurance underwriters who say they don't think that would materially lower the cost of insuring a vessel to take the risk of going through that. And two of the things which are actually pushing up oil prices, not just the oil itself, it's the cost of insuring and it's the cost of renting the tankers, both of which have exploded in recent weeks. So I'm not sure. I mean, I think that might help, but I'm not sure it would solve the problem.
Simon Jack, the BBC's business editor, thank you. If you like this episode, please subscribe here on YouTube. If there's any story you'd like us to cover, leave a comment below. And for more international stories, download the Global News Podcast wherever you get your BBC podcasts.